Okay, so it's July 27th, and I'm sitting with Terry Currie in the Diefenbunker at about 10 past 9 a.m. Um, so just to get started, maybe you could talk a little bit about what your job was while you were at the bunker and what you did.
Okay, my first contact with the Diefenbunker was the news went through the local valley that they were starting this huge project in Carp. And because I was aware of the international situation and political situation to a pretty good degree, I knew they were building some kind of a big military installation, and I knew it was a government project, and I knew if I could get on, I would get good money. And that was the most important factor to people in the local area, was that foundation construction was paying about 25 cents an hour more than any other construction company in the area. I was getting $1.28 an hour, or the year before I made 85 cents an hour with Sullivan's in Iron Park. So it was a little gold mine that fell into our laps. And it was a short drive here. My job, well, I was just a general laborer. And then they realized that I was calm, quiet, patient, and had my wits about me enough that I could be given a job spotting the trucks. I wouldn't fight with the drivers to get things backwards. So that was my job most of the summer. I just stood in the bottom of the big hole, and when a truck came, I indicated by signals where the guy should park the truck so they could load them full of gravel, and away you go. That was, I spent basically 3 months doing that.
Okay. And how did you get the job initially? Like, you were quite young at the time?
I was in university. I was 21 years of age. And I walked up to the gate, and it was quite early. I got here when construction season had just begun, mid-April, roughly. And I said, "You're looking for laborers?" And the guy said, "Sure." And I said, "Here I am. I know how to handle a pick and shovel, and I can drive a nail." And they gave me a job.
Was there any sort of security attached with your position?
No, there was security here. And they had security personnel. I don't know if they were RCMP or Army, and they would look at us, but once they got to know us, they didn't, they knew us day after day at the same time every day, and they didn't, there was no deep secret security in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So you were restricted from talking about certain things at work or that kind of thing?
Nothing that I remember, no. No, well, all we knew is we were digging a great big hole in Billy Montgomery's farm. I was actually here before it was Diefenbunker, right? I was here when I was a kid. The Montgomerys were friends of our family, and this was Billy Montgomery's farm. And it wasn't a really great farm because there was such a steep hill, and his horses used to be just about killed pulling loads of hay up the hill. And that's the hill they dug the Diefenbunker in.
Okay.
Yeah.
Huh, interesting. And what was the atmosphere like on the building site? Was it typical construction site, or were there additional things that happened because of this?
It was different, and it was sort of more driven than, and more closely managed than we were accustomed to working for local construction companies, where they would kind of tell you do this and then walk away and leave you to do it. But foundation construction, they had a lot of very capable people working for them. They knew what they were doing, and they had a schedule to stick to, and they kept us hopping. Yeah.
Did you know a lot of the other people working on it?
Quite a fair number, yeah. Yeah, like my old Uncle Tommy worked here at the same time I did, and lots of the fellows from Kenburn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lot of locals then.
Oh yeah, it was a gold mine to the local economy, I tell you.
Yeah. Yeah. Did you still live in the area once the Diefenbunker had finished being built?
I kind of wandered the world for a while, but my home farm is 8 miles from here. And that's where I still am now. Yeah.
And what was the attitude of people in the area towards this government project, and what did everyone know about it or want to know?
At first, there was sort of a resentment, like they're building a big shelter for themselves and they're not building one for us. And there was all sorts of sour grapes kind of talk about, they've got all these plush living quarters under the hill in Carp, and the rest of us are going to fry in the atomic waste. And there was a lot of complaining, bitching about like the amount of material that was being used and the quality and all that, just wasting, pouring all this huge amount of money into a hole in the ground that's no use to anybody. Eh? And the sort of attitude was like, if there's an atomic war, the whole world's going to be destroyed. So what's the use of having a Diefenbunker? I knew enough about what was going on, and like I knew enough about weapons and so on that I knew that yeah, the Diefenbunker was valid for like the first 7 or 8 years of its existence, because that was before computers, or when it was before transistors, compact computers. So intercontinental missiles were not accurate. So you had to fly over in a bomber and drop a bomb. And the Diefenbunker is made for bomber warfare. If they didn't hit it right on the roof, it would withstand the attack. But once they got accurate guided missiles, it no longer had any use. It was just a way of concentrating the enemy's government all on one target. Anyway, people just sort of had a low-level, grumbly attitude toward the Diefenbunker. That, you know, there are all those people sitting up there in that Diefenbunker in Carp doing nothing. Yeah.
But people knew that it was made for the case of an atomic.
Oh, sure. Yep, that was his purpose. It was a bomb shelter. Mm-hmm. We didn't have any idea that anybody else had them, except like people that took some sort of interest would say, well, the Americans have a bunch. You know, like Cheyenne Mountain, there's a whole mountain out west, that's just one gigantic bomb shelter. And some people knew that sort of stuff, but most people just thought it was a big hole in the ground to pour money in. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
You said that you had some interest and knowledge at the time of what was going on in world events.
Mm-hmm.
What were some of the stories that were coming through the media at the time?
Well, and living in your day and age, you can't have any idea of what it was like to live under the threat of imminent atomic war. And we were, for a period of 12 or 14 years, the world was in imminent danger of an all-out atomic war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And we used to, like 1958 to 64 was about the worst, eh? And yeah, they were right to build the Diefenbunker in terms of the situation at that time. And we used to get up in the morning and wonder where we're going to get blown up today. We were in school and we were doing atomic bomb drills, get under your desk. Yeah. Yeah, people were building, like lots of people around here built their own shelters in their own basements. There were lots of them around.
Really?
Yeah, oh yeah. People would put a year's supply of food down and you know, big barrels of clean drinking water and so on. Oh yeah. Well, like we felt, especially for like 60 to 63, the balloon could have gone up at any time. And we were within an hour of an atomic war in 1963, in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yeah.
What do you remember of the Cuban Missile Crisis? Did you know that it was going on at the time?
Oh yeah. Oh, it was on TV. They were sort of live. We could get American television, and we were watching, and Walter Cronkite was talking, that solemn, articulate voice of his, talking about, here are the Russian ships sailing towards Cuba. Here are the missiles on the decks. Here are the United States ships sortying from Norfolk, Virginia to sink those Russian ships if they attempt to land those missiles in Cuba. Yeah, that close. 20 minutes, they said.
Huh.
Yeah.
How did that affect your sort of day-to-day life if you had this awareness of
It was funny. It was a weird way to live, because you're walking around knowing that if somebody gets something wrong, the whole world can go up in an atomic cloud. And at the same time, life in Canada in the 1950s and 60s was great. Yeah, we were happy, we were prosperous. Canada was one of the most richest countries in the world. I went over to England, I took 1,000 Canadian dollars in my pocket, and they thought I was a millionaire. Yeah. Yeah. Canada was second only to the States in prosperity. Everybody else was poor. We were rich. Life was good. Yeah. And then we might all get blown up tomorrow, but in the meantime, yeah.
Were there people around you who you thought, like you said, some people were building bomb shelters in their home, but who had a sense of sort of more serious anxiety or a serious concern?
Oh yeah, some people were really paranoid about their fear of what was going on. The ones who built serious atomic bomb shelters with 2-foot thick cement reinforced walls, and yeah, there's a couple of them not far from here. Like I could show you. In those days, you drive by this house and you see this hump of earth in the ground out behind. Looked like a weeping tile bed, but there's an exhaust chimney sticking up out of it. That was an atomic bomb shelter. Yeah, there was lots of them around. Yeah.
And do you feel that people would have been reassured by knowing that the Diefenbunker was here? Or
No, we're not going to get into it. Yeah. Yeah. I also worked at the other end of the system. I worked in Ottawa on Parliament Hill, around Parliament Hill one summer. At that time, with the National Capital Commission, it was the Federal District Commission in those days, and those guys were full of all sorts of tales about how they had buses in a secret underground garage just off behind where the National Archives is now, down in that sort of limestone gully that goes down behind there. There was supposed to be a secret garage down there with buses ready to run. They could load everybody on and get them out to Carp in about half an hour from the time the balloon went up. And they figured that they would have 5 to 10 hours of warning for a bomber attack. So that gave them ample time to load the Prime Minister on the bus and get him out here. We also had the railway running from downtown Ottawa, right by where the War Museum is now, was the railway yards. And that railway track ran directly out here to Carp. That's the track that runs through Carp. So they could bring a special train out if they had time to organize it.
That's amazing. Sorry, just one second. What about your own family? How did they feel about the Diefenbunker and maybe your...
Well, they thought it was wonderful that I was making such good money. And I was able to pay my own way through university. And they were glad that the opportunity was there. They saw it as a money-making opportunity. They just were resigned. If it was an atomic war, we're all going to fry anyway, so don't worry about it. That was their attitude. From the time, particularly that sort of crucial period that you talked about from 58 to 64-ish, but even later than that, what were some of the more significant news stories or media stories that you remember that were Cold War focused that had people talking? Well, the big one was, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis. That was November '62. And that was a period of about 10 days when the world hung in the balance. And then virtually exactly a year later was the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And that followed directly on. And all that period, like when we built the Diefenbunker, there was peace and quiet in Canada and the States. And by 10 years later, the United States was a scene of major social disorder with the civil rights movement on one hand and civil disobedience and draft dodgers and so on, anti-war protesters on the other. And the United States was in a real condition of social unrest and violent controversy and so on. And Canadians didn't share the situation. We didn't go to Vietnam. We didn't fight in Vietnam, but we still had people parading down Yonge Street yelling, "Hell no, we won't go," because we sort of borrowed the Americans' causes, eh? So we had civil rights marches in Ottawa. I went to a civil rights march in Ottawa, and all of Ottawa's 35 black people were all there, because the black population in Canada at that time was not very large, and certainly wasn't very important in Ottawa. They're more down in southern Ontario. But it was funny, we adopted the Americans' causes, we didn't have. Now in Quebec it was another matter, like 1970 was the October crisis. This place was pretty lively during the October crisis. That's when True came out here and checked the length of the bed to make sure we're long enough, eh? Yeah.
Were you in the area during the October crisis, or where were you?
I was on my way to Ottawa University, and I was put off the road by the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry and their armored personnel carriers coming right down Highway 17. In their armored personnel carriers tearing up the pavement on their way to Parliament Hill, securing all the sites in Ottawa against the FLQ. And I was there and I saw them drive by.
You said that Canada often took up the American causes.
We did that, yeah.
Do you feel that was a similar case for Cold War kind of thing, like attitudes maybe towards the Soviet Union and portrayal of communism?
You have to realize we knew who the enemy was. The enemy was the Soviet Union. They wanted to overthrow us and destroy our social system and impose a Marxist dictatorship on us like they were enjoying in Russia. They had lots of tanks and no soup. And we didn't want that at all. And we were part of the Grand Anglo-Saxon Alliance at that time. Britain, Canada, and the United States were sort of the triangle of power. We were actually significant military power compared to the rest of the world in those days. Think about, in the top 10 militarily. Yeah.
What did you know about Diefenbunker at the time, and what did you think about him?
I voted for Dief. My family were all lifetime Liberals, and I voted for Dief. They nearly disowned me. But the Liberals were so stale. Louis Saint Laurent and those guys were so stale, and they had got into a big stink of corruption with the pipeline crisis in 1957. And Dief was the guy who was up in Parliament railing away at them. So we all said, vote for Dief, vote for the chief. And he had an overwhelming landslide majority in 1958. And everybody said, ooh, now things will change. But he was a wonderful campaigner and a bad, bad prime minister. He wouldn't share authority, and he couldn't handle running a whole country all by himself. So he was not a successful prime minister. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. How important do you think his role was in the Cold War politics?
The Canadian military recommended to him that we build the Diefenbunker, and he acceded. Yeah. But it was actually Louis Saint Laurent that had started construction. The plans were drawn up while Saint Laurent was prime minister. Yeah. And the construction started, I guess, just after Diefenbunker came to the prime minister's office. Right around that time. But it was a project that had been in the works for several years.
What sorts of fears and activities regarding communism do you remember, if any?
Oh, I remember we had communist members in Parliament. Yeah, Winnipeg always elected at least a couple of commies. Northern Ontario, the mining towns that have a communist or two. I don't think they ever had more than about 5 or 6 communist members of Parliament in Canada, but we did have them. Tim Buck was the head of the Communist Party of Canada, and Tim wanted to overthrow the capitalist order and establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, and the orthodox communism. And they really made everybody really nervous because they had this whole different system of belief, and their system of indoctrination and their system of Marxist analysis and so on. Just everything sort of felt like it was on the wrong foot. Everything felt like it was out of, it was hard to put your finger on how they were really off base, but they were, their whole point of departure was just wrong in terms of our culture. Yeah. Yeah.
And how did the Summit Series, I assume that you remember
how did the what?
The Summit Series, the hockey tournament with Russia. How do you feel that fit into this sort of fear of the Soviet Union and communism, and then?
Well, yeah, you get Cashman with his stick upraised, going to club the convener of the Moscow game of that tournament. And he's threatening this little Russian official with his upraised hockey stick. It was hatred, and it was intense. Just like the players, okay, they respected each other on the ice, but anybody outside the rink, off the ice, Alan Eagleson and those guys there, they hated the Reds, and the Reds hated them. It was a lot better than having an atomic war, but it was pretty close to it a lot of times. It was vicious, vicious hockey. I never saw anything like it.
Yeah. Do you feel it was a good thing for relations between Canada and the Soviet Union?
No. The Russians probably thought we were a pretty silly bunch of people to put so much emphasis on a hockey game. They didn't like the fact that we won, and they plotted their revenge. But at the same time, they recognize it's a game and it's not really important. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you reacted when you heard about the fall of the Berlin Wall in the late 80s?
I remember reading an article in Atlantic magazine in 1989 by a gentleman who drove a Rolls Royce from London to Sebastopol in Russia. And he was a very well-traveled British correspondent. And he wrote about his travels in a Rolls Royce through the Soviet Empire. So he went in from Austria to Hungary, he went across Hungary, Romania, into what's now Moldova, across the Ukraine, and down to the Crimea to Sebastopol. And nobody had ever seen anything like a Rolls Royce. Like as soon as he crossed the border into Hungary, the road went from being a beautiful Germanic paved 4-lane highway to being a narrow, broken 2-lane pavement with geese and ducks being herded along it, and ox carts, far more common than automobiles as soon as you got into the Soviet sphere. Because they spent all their money on armaments. All the tax money went to build tanks and jet planes. And he described going along the highway, and there were watchtowers along the highway. Every 10 kilometers there's a watchtower with a machine gun and KGB troops in it. And he said, the granitic strength of the Soviet state. 3 years later, it was in ruins. 3 years later. And I was just as blown away as everybody else. I thought it would last for another 50 years. No, it had feet of clay. Once it started to shift and slide, it just all broke down in no time. And one of the great surprises, I would say, international goings on. The Berlin Wall was just a symptom of that whole revolution in Eastern Europe. Yeah.
Why do you think it's important to remember the Cold War and your own memories of them? That kind of thing?
The Cold War was an extremely important part of our past. For a whole 2 generations of us lived under the threat of annihilation in an atomic war. And our lives were conditioned to a certain degree all the time by the threat of that war. Like our economies were distorted by the need to maintain high levels of armaments. Like if we hadn't had to have all the weaponry we had around, we would have been a much more prosperous country. Yeah. War is expensive. Getting ready for war is expensive. It takes a lot of good stuff out of the economy.
Did you feel that how did the Cold War change over the period? Because, I mean, you were a university student kind of at the start.
Yeah, it was extremely intense. We now know that Stalin intended to invade Western Europe in 1948. He actually had the plans all drawn up. He had the tanks all on the line. And then his general said, like, Comrade Stalin, they have all these bombers that can drop atomic bombs. We better not. And so they decided not to. But he was ready to roll in 48 because the Americans' armies had all gone home from Europe, except for skeleton forces. And the Brits had just a couple of divisions in northern Germany. So there was nobody to stop the Russians. They could have gone right to the end. They could have gone to Gibraltar in a week. But after that, the great crisis was at the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then it just sort of became less imminent because they had the red line, the red telephone line, the hotline, so that the president of the States could talk to the chairman of the Soviet Union person to person with interpreters so they could make sure they weren't going to blunder into mutual annihilation. And it became, once the Soviet Union got sufficiently strong, the Americans weren't going to attack them, and the Americans were always way too strong for the Soviets to really go toe-to-toe. They would have been just annihilated. Like, the Americans had 8 hydrogen bombs labeled for Moscow. And that's what that was really about, was mutually assured destruction. And yeah, once they reached that balance, it just was scary and expensive, but it was nowhere near as dangerous as it had been in the mid-60s, early 60s. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was more stable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And do you feel that was reflected in the way that people lived their lives and thought about world politics?
Yeah, it became much less urgent. Like, because we had this standoff with nuclear strategic weapons, ordinary weapons and so on didn't become as important. The atomic bomb ensured peace for a long time. It has for a long time. Yeah.
That's true.
It scared the politicians into behaving themselves because they could get killed too.
Do you have any other stories that you wanted to tell, or things that you wanted to share?
I say it was fun when we started out. I say we, it was Barry Bruce and Bob Borden and Connie Higgins who said the Diefenbunker should not be destroyed. It should be made into a museum. And I was in on the first or second meeting there and kind of was there to encourage rather than to do anything much. I think I wrote a couple of newspaper articles. But I thought that was a wonderful act of imagination and understanding on the part of a tiny handful of people who were responsible for making this into a museum. Because the government wanted to either fill it with cement and forget it, or turn it into a mushroom farm. And I even knew a guy who wanted to make it into a fireworks factory. And so I thought the community was blessed, and there was enough intelligent perception around that they said, okay, maybe there is something about the Diefenbunker that it should be a museum. And now it's one of the most popular museums in the Ottawa area. And I used to love guiding here because people's perceptions are so sort of bizarre of what the Cold War was like, especially young people who haven't lived through it and think, like, what was all the fuss about? Why would they do this, eh? And no, like the Russians would have those great May Day exhibitions in Tushino Air Base at Moscow. They'd fly all these huge bombers over, and they had bombs in them. And they had a bomb labeled for Carp in one of those. And they had a couple of bombs for Ottawa. And we weren't going to get away with it. We were a target, and we were right to build a bomb shelter in terms of the time. It soon lost its usefulness, but at the time, yeah. Like the one at Bonn in Germany has 8 kilometers of tunnels, eh? How's that?
That's great. That's great. I haven't had someone talk so fully about the Cold War side. Most people want to focus on the bunker itself.
I lived through it, and I was aware, like I was always interested in history, current events, eh? Yeah. And I taught history too, so. Yeah. And I lived through it as it unfolded. Yeah. And now what I'm doing is I'm doing local history of the Ottawa Valley, colonization, settling the Fitzroy Township, and back to my roots. Yeah.